chunking method, and pattern method. As I mentioned earlier in the video, learning the grappling art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does not come quickly or naturally to most people. In order to be able to start understanding how to grapple in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you need to first learn and memorize a good amount of techniques to add to your repertoire, to then start using and work on in building your foundation. If you want to speak a language, you have to start off knowing a good amount of vocabulary words first. When it comes to memorizing and learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, people will find it to be a challenge because of complexity. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques often involve multiple steps and intricate movements that need to be executed precisely in a somewhat step-by-step process. What techniques you need to start learning first are the fundamentals and basics, which at my gym are around 150. It can take years and can be very hard to start trying to know them all for the average beginner grappler, as well as trying to know the many variations of each technique, and understanding when and how to use them requires significant practice. So to start to try to understand and make sense of the complexity, I ask the question to anyone: is drilling a technique over and over for who knows how many times until the technique finally makes sense? Is it really the only way to effectively memorize a technique? When I was first starting out in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and was introduced to the drilling method, my first thoughts is that I saw the drilling method to be the same method or another form called rote learning, a method that I had previous experience using most of my life and eventually gave up trying to use as a way to memorize things. If you don't know what rote learning is a memorization technique based on repetition. The idea is that the more you repeat something, the more likely you are to remember it. This method emphasizes the memorization of information without necessarily understanding its meaning or context. Or in other words, just do something over and over again until you annoy your brain enough to finally memorize it. I am not really a big fan of rote learning, as you can tell. In my experience, after discovering and using many other better or more efficient learning and memory methods to make my study life for many different things to become drastically easier, I currently see rote learning to be a not very effective way to memorize things. To me, it doesn't get the job done smoothly and just a more stressful process to do it that way. Ever since when I first started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and saw how much the drilling method was similar to rote learning, I think I just subconsciously wanted to avoid doing it that way. Most people, when they start out not knowing anything better in trying to learn something new, will likely default in using this rote learning as a way to memorize things, because it is a straightforward method that doesn't require complex understanding or analysis. It just involves repetition, which is simple to implement. Most of us probably were brought up one way or another, or in an educational system of having rote learning traditionally emphasized as mostly the only way to learn things, taught to us as a tried and true method. Back then, before I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and discovered my lazy method or any other learning methods, this was how I thought the process of memorization worked. That if I wanted to learn new information, I would have to constantly review it over and over again until it sticks to my memory. In scientific studies, it shows a fact that the human brain is a highly energy-demanding organ. At rest, the brain uses about 20% of the body's total energy expenditure, despite only making up about 2% of the body's weight. So for your brain, it will never hold on to information that it does not think is important enough to hold on to, because it burns so much energy that it is a matter matter of life or death. The human brain does a lot to keep the human body running the best it can. The human brain purpose is mainly related for survival. So whatever information you give it better be worth enough to have the brain use more energy to make room for it. To make your brain deem an information worthy of having, you have to either be constantly exposed to that information or anything that is related to it enough until your brain decides it's worth keeping long term, or really make it easy for the brain to understand its value, that the brain can immediately ingrain it to memory right away. If the information is not deemed worth it for the brain, then the brain's natural ability to forget will kick in and get rid of it, because forgetting is a mechanism that protects the brain by managing cognitive load and energy use. So what are the ways or methods that we can do to make the information worthy enough for the brain to keep? And I ask, what is the most optimal and easy way or method to do it that works best for me? Is rote learning the only way? And the answer I found is no. Throughout my life, I honestly never really found success or value with rote learning for memorization. I tried many times, but rote learning just wasn't effective to use to memorize things long term. Nowadays, I currently see it to be an inferior and crude method that just wastes my time doing. And again, ever since I discovered other better ways to memorize things to get more done, since then, out of subconscious habit, I automatically wanted to avoid doing any method that is similar to rote learning, like drilling, for example. There are just those aspects of rote learning in the drilling method that I just don't like. And again, that is the idea of focusing and relying too much on repetition to keep doing something over and over again until it's memorized and makes sense, which doesn't seem to make sense for me anymore. Instead of focusing on repetition, I learned that I should focus more on the process. Here is how I look at the process when it comes to memorization. Process is truly what makes information worthy for the brain to keep. If the process of memorizing is bad, then you need more repetition to make up for it. If the process of information is good, then you don't need as much repetition. I think rote learning or drilling has really little to no process to be effective for memorization. So it just only relies in mainly using a lot of repetition to make up for it. So my plan was to basically improve the process in my own way that works best for me. And I believe that I succeeded in doing so. Now, before I can show you my process that I created to make memorization easier for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, I have to first talk about something called short-term memory and long-term memory. If you don't know what short-term memory and long-term memory is, here is a quick rundown. Short-term memory and long-term memory are two fundamental types of memory that plays critical roles in our ability to understand, process, and recall information. Short-term memory. Short-term memory, also known as working memory, involves the temporary storage of information that is currently being processed or used. It's like a mental workspace where we hold information for brief periods, typically for about 20 to 30 seconds. Although this can be extended through techniques such as rehearsal, short-term memory is limited in capacity. It's often cited that adults can hold about 7 items of information at a time.
The bathroom code is 6648261035549. Could you say that again?
This limitation can vary based on the nature of the information and individual differences. Short-term memory is crucial for daily activities such as holding a phone number in mind long enough to dial it, or remembering a sentence you've just read as you move on to the next. It plays a key role in cognitive tasks like problem solving, reasoning, and comprehension. Long-term memory. Long-term memory, on the other hand, refers to the storage of information over extended periods, potentially lasting from minutes to a lifetime. Unlike short-term memory, the capacity of long-term memory is believed to be virtually unlimited. It encompasses everything we know and can recall, including facts, experiences, skills, and the knowledge of how to perform tasks, also known as procedural memory. Information typically passes through short-term memory, also known as working memory, before it can be stored in long-term memory. Think of short-term memory as a kind of entryway or temporary storage where information is briefly held and processed. If the information is deemed important or is repeatedly used or rehearsed, it can then move into long-term memory, where it can be stored for much longer periods, from days to even a lifetime. This process allows us to filter and prioritize the vast amount of information we encounter daily, ensuring that only the most relevant or used information is kept for long-term use. There is this thing called cognitive load. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental effort being used in the working memory, also known as short-term memory. It is a concept from cognitive psychology that describes the strain placed on the brain's cognitive resource when performing tasks. Or another way to describe it, cognitive load is a crucial concept in understanding how people process information and perform tasks. Managing cognitive load effectively can improve learning, problem solving, and overall cognitive performance. Now, what if information is too much for the short-term memory to handle? There is a term called cognitive overload that can occur when too much information is presented at once, exceeding the capacity of short-term memory. When more information is received than it can handle, some of it may not be effectively processed or transferred to long-term memory. This is because the cognitive system can become overwhelmed, leading to difficulties in focusing, processing, and encoding information for long-term storage. Because again, the short-term memory, aka working memory, has a limited capacity, often described as being able to hold about 2 to 7 items at once. So any information or task that has high cognitive load can quickly exceed this capacity, leading to decreased performance and learning. Definitely, the task of shoving knowledge and the complexity of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques into the short-term memory will exceed that capacity. When it comes to learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you need Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu materials in your head to work with. The only problem is getting the materials inside your head first. Again, going to back then, from my experience of used to being a struggling white belt grappler, it used to be that whenever I am in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, I always felt overwhelmed and overloaded at how much information is being thrown at me, that I just felt like it is just not going to stick in my head after class. And probably the next day or two, again, following the traditional way to learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if I don't drill, don't attend the next class soon enough, and overall just not being consistent with my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training to go over, follow up, and review what I am learning, I am going to end up completely forgetting it all quickly. This experience was always truly a constant frustration for a lazy guy like me. But like I said before, how do you expect to learn if you can't memorize shit? Each Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques overall to me just contains so much information that it is always overwhelming. Back when I was a beginner, I feel like I was not really able to absorb what's being taught in class effectively at all, cause it just seems so large and forgettable information to fit in this tiny brain of mine to make it stay long enough to be useful. Almost 3 years of feeling this way, of having problems, of not being able to memorize the basics and fundamentals, cause for some reason it seems so complex and overwhelming for me to keep up in trying to understand them. It used to always feel like a stressful experience to learn new Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, which constantly always bothered me. So at some point during the time of being in pandemic lockdown, eventually I came to focus more on the idea on how memorizing and learning information should be processed to make it strategically sync better to memorized, instead of always trying to do what I feel, trying to just constantly force it using the old usual stressful and harder way. That doesn't work for a lazy me. What I am getting at is to make the process better and less stressful, I really have to find a method that can help in dealing on this aspect of managing cognitive load. At that point, as I have already made progress in figuring out a convenient source of where I am going to memorize techniques from, of having control over the pace of how much information is being thrown at me, which I am again so glad that we live in the age of the internet and having a pause button that we could press and rewind for online Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorials. But now the next real focus is to manage the cognitive load, aka how can I actually memorize all of those information of the complexities and variations that techniques can have in those Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tutorials, cause just one Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique tutorial can still have so many parts, movements, nuances, and steps to it, where it's still going to feel like a chore and a hassle to take some time to memorize them all, and still can just overwhelm and overload this brain of mine. So the next piece of the puzzle, if I want to avoid overloading and overwhelming my mind when it comes to learning and memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, I have to figure out a way to make the process better so that my short-term memory is able to handle and overcome any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu knowledge I throw at it, and is more willing to open the gates of long-term memory for those knowledge to enter more easily. I was looking for an information processing method that could be the answer, a way that makes memorizing as much information of every single parts, details, or steps of each and every different Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques out there, of looking them up and trying to learn them from online tutorials, go through my short-term memory to my long-term memory much easier, faster, and without feeling overloaded, that I can feel confident that whatever Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu information goes into my head will stay and not be easily forgettable. I always ask myself how funny my memory works sometimes. For example, why is it that every time I watch a certain movie for the first time, especially if it's a good one, that even after a week or even a month after watching it, I can still almost remember everything about it, the character's name, the plot, the faces. But anytime when it comes to meeting a person in real life for the first time, of them telling me their name, and after like the next 5 minutes, I already ended up completely forgetting their name. Embarrassing, but it just happens. Why is it that, say, a 2-hour movie can easily go into the long-term memory while a a simple name has a hard time staying in the short-term memory. So in a way, I thought interestingly when comparing the two situations, how can I recreate the same effect that has that level of memory potency that remembering a movie gives, that makes it so easily memorable and ingrained after seeing it for the first time once, that makes it hard to forget? Well, here is the answer. Eventually, I found, modified, and applied a learning processing method called chunking to be used to memorize Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques in my own way that I found to be very potent and effective. Like, it gives me almost the same feeling of experiencing remembering a movie in terms of being able to recall information. But anyways, first, what is chunking? For all of you who don't know, chunking is a cognitive strategy that involves breaking down information into smaller, manageable units or chunks to make it easier to process and remember. This method is based on the way how our short-term memory works. It's generally limited to holding about 7 pieces of information at once, according to a well-known theory by psychologist George A. Miller. By organizing information into chunks, the cognitive load on short-term memory is reduced, making it easier to encode information into long-term memory for future retrieval. Benefits of chunking in learning. 1. Improved memory retention. By organizing information into chunks, learners can improve their ability to store and recall information. 2. Enhanced understanding. Chunking helps in understanding complex information by breaking it down into more digestible parts. Understanding the relationships between these parts within a larger whole can also deepen comprehension. 3. Increased focus. By focusing on smaller units of information at a time, learners can reduce cognitive overload, making it easier to concentrate and engage with the material. 4. Efficiency in learning. Chunking can make study sessions more productive by allowing learners to cover more material in less time, thanks to improved retention and understanding. Chunking is a powerful learning strategy that simplifies complex information, making it more manageable and easier to remember. By effectively breaking down and organizing material into chunks, learners can enhance their memory, understanding, and overall efficiency in learning, whether for academic study, professional development, or personal growth. Incorporating chunking into your learning routine can significantly improve your ability to absorb and retain information. Here is an analogy that I always like to compare it to. Information needs to be condensed down in a different form to make it easier to interpret and understand. For me, information is like eating a raw, large steak. I can either try to eat the whole thing all at once, which will make me sick and give me hours worth of stomach aches and cramps. Some people can do that, but for me, I can't. To be more effective of how I can eat it and digest it, I can cook it to make it less gamey, put steak sauce on top to make it more edible, and cut it into thinly slices of tiny pieces for easier consumption, better absorption, and have better enjoyment. So same way with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. How can I break and chunk the information of like learning a specific Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique from, again, usually from a video tutorial, to make it easier for my brain to digest and memorize? If it can take high effort to slowly try to memorize a whole technique, how about instead, to avoid giving high effort and slow results, we break the technique into smaller, low effort, manageable pieces and easily memorize it all faster. So I thought about it for a while and finally came up with a solution to make use of chunking by converting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques into this code form that I made. It's in a way my own sort of puzzle solving language that is an integral piece to my lazy method. To briefly sum it up, because it's a bit long to explain everything about it in this video, by chunking and condensing information to this code form that I made, I am able to break down the information to digestible pieces, categorizing, compartmentalizing, and organizing each piece and parts of a technique in a way that makes sense to me. Then after successfully converting it the way I want, with this way of forming the information, I can now quickly trace, memorize, and review the tutorial of a technique much easier and faster without too much hassle of overloading my brain. In this code form, I made it so that every piece of information I try to study from a video tutorial of a technique becomes like a map that I can associate and relate information with, that just sort of links everything together and keeps my memorizing more organized and free-formed. This way of converting information requires me to read the code in a visualized way, where the code acts as a roadmap to help me follow to visualize in figuring out a pattern through association and relation, and guide me to figuring out the answer. The process of doing it this way is that my brain is more able to quickly form a deeper, understandable way or pattern that makes it easier to recall the whole information of a technique. To be clearer, I will give you an oversimplified example of my lazy code method that not only utilizes chunking method, but is also combined with another method. This relates to a method from actors trying to memorize a script faster for movies or TV shows. Here I will give a ridiculous example sentence for you, the viewer, to memorize. Johnny went to the Apple store to buy Samsung phones, but the workers told him that they don't sell that. Johnny becomes enraged and tries to fight everyone in the store until the cops came. They arrested Johnny and threw him in jail for being disruptive in public. Not the best sentence I can come up with, but anyways, can you memorize this? To memorize this sentence word for word exactly, what most people do is try drilling it by rereading the sentence over and over again for who knows how long until they finally get it memorized and ingrained into their brain, which I bet the experience of doing it that way for most people can be annoying, takes more of your time than necessary, and depletes your precious mental energy quickly. Instead of trying to say that sentence over and over again until you painstakingly finally memorize it and strain that short-term memory, what I do instead to quickly and easily memorize this is first understand the story or the context of the sentence. That there is a man named Johnny who is throwing a fit in the Apple store. Once I have a basic understanding of the context of the sentence to prime my brain with, I then, with a piece of paper, take the first letter in every word in the sentence, add the plus sign in between them. It should look like this. Now read the normal sentence once and then try to read the sentence again in this code-like format. Your goal is to relate and associate this code form of the sentence to the story. Don't focus too much on trying to remember each of the letters associated with the words individually. Follow reading it by understanding the context of the story the best you can. Okay. Johnny went to the Apple store to buy Samsung phones, but the workers told him that they don't sell that. Johnny becomes enraged and tries to fight everyone in the store until the cops came. They arrested Johnny and threw him in jail for being disruptive in public. I hope from this little demonstration or exercise helps that you would find it to be very much easier and helpful to understand the code portion of my lazy method. Overall, it almost feels like magic, like your brain just naturally and automatically recognizes in figuring out a relation and pattern based on any association and related information that it can extract from what you already know, and you should be able to decipher and read this without much problem. It is like some sort of brain hack to memorize in such an easy, weird way. Don't know exactly why this works, but overall, all I can say is that every letter acts as a hint and guidance for your brain to figure out and connect everything together, using relation and association in order to finally figure out in recalling the whole sentence accurately enough that makes reasonable sense, that again are based on already having a basic idea of the context of the sentence. Once you can read the sentence in this letter code form a couple of times successfully, now try reciting from just your head without looking at this code form. Starting with the first word, you will most likely find that you are more able to successfully memorize the pattern and can recite the whole sentence example more accurately and faster without too much struggle or stress at all. I highly recommend you try this method more in your own time. Test it out, because whether you are trying to memorize song lyrics, speeches, scripts, this will make your life easier to do those things.
So I've had it where I would try to be off book before everyone else. I would get it down to an acronym. So if there was 1,000 words I had to remember, I would just remember the first letter of each, and I would put it on a piece of poster board, and then I would stand away from it, not as far as you and your archery setup over there, but far enough away to where I can see it but kind of can't see it, back when my vision was a little more clear. And I would just run it and run it and run it.
Not exactly what this method is called, but for now, I would call this useful method that helps you memorize scripts or lines, the pattern method. And with this pattern method, I wanted to see if I can tweak and modify it to not just memorize sentences or lines, but also Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique tutorials as well. Big jump, I know. If you haven't noticed or caught on to what I have been saying, I have been saying a lot about memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques through using the idea of association and relation. This is important because you see, I learned that instead of forcing your energy-intensive brain to make more room to fit new information by trying to memorize through repetition, I find that it is easier and less energy demanding to use the power of association and relation instead. The power of association and relation is a highly effective way or process of thinking for enhancing memorization. It involves linking new information to existing knowledge or creating connections between different pieces of new information. Both the chunking and the pattern method, the way that I use them, heavily revolves around in taking advantage of this process or idea of memorizing things through association and relation by really focusing more on creating strong, meaningful connections in my mind to make memorization easier and more efficient. And from all my attempts to figure out a way to create a method that is all about using the power of association and relation, what resulted is that it led me to create this code thing. This code thing is really a huge part to my lazy method that helps me get results that I want. With this idea of the power of association and relation, I finally understood why a 2-hour movie could easily pass through to long-term memory while a simple name of somebody has a hard time staying in short-term memory. Well, the reasons why is because of association and relation. Remembering a movie is generally easier due to the engagement of multiple senses, emotional and contextual cues, repetition, and the creation of a network of associations that aid in transferring information from short-term to long-term memory. In contrast, remembering a name often involves a brief and less engaging process that makes it harder to encode and retain. The main point is a movie has more information but has a low cognitive load because the process to memorize it is powerful. Watching a movie engages multiple senses and cognitive processes, which aids in deeper processing and better memory retention, while a name has less information but can have higher cognitive load, especially when you're dealing with meeting multiple people at once and how complex the pronunciation of names can be. But in a way, learning and remembering a name requires the brain to focus specifically on that single piece of information. To be honest, now that I think about it, saying that learning people's names can be a high cognitive load is a bit of a stretch or silly. Unless your goal is to memorize every single name of people you meet or see throughout your life, good luck with that, because I never met anyone that is able to do that. I just wanted to use learning names as some sort of common example that most people experience having a hard time with, because it seems like a simple task, but for some reason, it is hard to do. It turns out statistically that most people are bad at remembering names, and names are just one of those things that often get stuck in short-term memory and quickly fade from memory unless we put out more effort to keep it to memory. Most people that we meet throughout our life, there are really only a few that we bother to learn their names. Either it is because those people are relevant to our life, or they provoke and cause a certain level of emotional feeling in us to come out.
No.
Well, I guess it's time to say goodbye to the security guards whose names I never learned. Take care, Captain. Stay golden, Chief. Be well, buckaroo. Bye, Francesca Louise Alessandro. Say hi to Max and Samuel and your sister Eloise for me. And good luck with your night courses.
And if we look at it that way in perspectives, then names are pretty easy to memorize and has a pretty low cognitive load. In a way, when it comes to memorization, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques are similar to names, that they both always get stuck in short-term memory when you first learn them. So with memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques specifically, let's give more context and sensory input to work with in getting them into long-term memory faster and easier. So yeah, by combining chunking method and the pattern method together, converting them into this code form and putting it to practice, the results is that whenever I want to learn a new technique from a video tutorial, it now has become a more effective and easier process to memorize. Using the chunking method, I am able to break and chunk almost any Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques I come across online into each of these what I call blocks. Each different blocks represent action. movements, imagination, ideas, details, and any associations that I can come up with to relate anything about the technique I would be breaking down at that moment. That when categorized, compartmentalized, and connected to each other will act as hints for my brain to follow to start putting the pieces together. And these pluses and other symbols that I use in my code method acts as connectors to each block, each having their own meaning that when placed in between the blocks will define the different interpretations and interactions of how the code for the information is presented. This chunking process helps me to start priming my brain by deeply taking time to think about the technique to really build a strong sense of familiarity. It is like I am creating questions for myself to figure out the answers to. When the chunking process is done and I try to read through the code form of that technique, beginning to end, in my attempt to figure out what I just wrote and figure out the meaning of why I wrote it this way through association and relation, that's when the pattern method kicks in of constantly thinking, how does all of this code relate and associate to anything about the subject or context of the technique I am trying to recall from memory. All of this will cause my brain to sorta enter a state of deciphering and making logical guesses that seem to make sense enough to fit the whole picture puzzle of the technique together to give meaning on what works and why it works, of understanding why each puzzle piece should fit the way it does. This is how my lazy method works in memorizing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. When I do it this way, it almost feels like I am not doing most of the work as much, and my brain is handling all of it automatically for me instead to memorize the technique. Or to put it more simply another way, because I feel like what I just said there could still be confusing to understand, the way I read the code and how I use it as a way to memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique, the goal is to always read going down the lines until I can reach to the end. As I am reading down the lines of the code, I am constantly putting my brain into a problem-solving state of figuring out which pieces should fall into place that makes reasonable sense enough that I can feel confident in. By the time I reach reading the end of the last line of the code for that specific technique I want to memorize from a tutorial, I feel like the information by then, before I realize it, has already passed over my short-term memory and into my long-term memory without me trying much. To me, the process is so powerful that it prevents my brain from being able to prune and get rid of precious knowledge easily after I have memorized it. It is like I am tricking my brain to think all of this information I give it is worth keeping. Before we can get in any deeper, to be more clearer to what do I mean when I said by putting myself in a problem-solving state as I am reading the code, here is also another example. It is like a crossword puzzle. Every block I filled successfully with a word gives me another block line to figure out and connect the word's letters to. I always use the hints from every previous block that's been filled successfully by a letter or two. Use those as guidance to narrow down the word I am looking for that seem to fit the context in answering the provided definition or questions clues until I can finally make a good logical guess of what word definitely belongs there. Fill out the empty block slot, then keep branching from there until the whole word puzzle is completed. Each line of my lazy code going down are all connected to each other in some way. Every line I successfully am able to decode by problem solving will give me hints to solve the next line. It's like a snowball effect. It all just rolls and gets bigger until it finally forms a complete giant snowball. Another example is, let's say you are driving to your friend's place from your house. You always used a GPS to go there because you naturally got no sense of direction. Can't go anywhere without it. You're like Zoro from One Piece, who is constantly getting lost. Now, one day you don't have a GPS available this time around, and you need to get to your friend's house for whatever reason. So now, if your house is point A and your friend's house is point C, you gotta figure out point B that connects the two in order to get to your friend's house. Point B is basically are all the landmarks that you definitely know to be signs or places that are between you and your friend's house. Even though you don't know how to get to your friend's house without a GPS, to start off, you at least do know how to get to a specific familiar restaurant that you always pass by whenever you go to your friend's place. If you go to that restaurant, you can feel like you're getting closer to your friend's place. Then, once you are at the restaurant, you have to think, what is the next place that you can figure out and use as a landmark that is close by to the restaurant and that you know for sure it's still heading into the direction towards your friend's place. As you keep on narrowing it down, heading to each familiar landmark, and constantly you just keep figuring out the next landmarks one after the other that can be signs and indicators to know that you are getting closer. That just makes the most logical sense until it finally helps you reach your friend's house. In a way, those landmarks all become part of point B. That's the problem solving part of my lazy method is focus on, of trying to fill the gaps in between of knowing where to start and where it ends. I have to think of ways of how pieces of point B can fit in my code method of being able to connect A to C that can make the most logical sense for a technique that I am trying to memorize work. To simply put, again, as long as you know where you start and you know where you want to end up at, all the pieces in the middle needs to make sense enough to lead you from beginning to the end. Every line of my code is a memory landmark, and to go to each landmark, I have to actively think and be engaged to figure out pieces of the answer in order to pass through them until I reach my final destination of solving the answer. This process of thinking is what I find helps to memorize a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique. It makes the idea of doing each step of a technique feel more common sense of why I am doing it this specific way, which just overall makes it easier for me to remember and recall the techniques. The whole process of doing it this way almost becomes like a game that I can easily enjoy solving and know that I am rewarded at the end, just in case to be clearer to stop any more confusion. If anyone who is asking whenever someone is looking at this code equation, no, I don't memorize this whole equation code looking thing. This equation looking code thing only serves as my guidance and for me to decipher and solve the answer, of only helping me make sense of understanding a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique that I am trying to memorize much better in a way that almost feels like instinctively I am just following a pattern that seems to lead me to the answer, helps me build build an idea of a tangible way to get to the answer. Even if it's not the perfect way to get to the answer at first, I at least have a path to walk on to try to get to the answer, and I can always refine and fix the road later with more review and experience. With this way of processing information, I also think of it as letting my mind naturally have the freedom and fun in getting to the answer as close to it as I can. Instead of stressing out and get frustrated from trying to always focus in landing on the exact or perfect answer, there is this term or phenomenon that I found interesting back when I first learned about it in my psychology class in high school, that suggests that people can understand the meaning of words in a sentence even when the inner letters of each word are jumbled, as long as the first and last letters remain in place. The concept is called typoglycemia. Here is an example. Tell me if you can read this. If you read it and got the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, then you are seeing what I am seeing, hopefully. Unless you are seeing anything different, then comment down below the video. But overall strange that you can read this sentence correctly, even though it is all jumbled up like this. But your brain just automatically can just figure it out and read it like no problem. This concept highlights the brain's ability to interpret words based on context and familiarity with the language, rather than needing to analyze each letter individually. In a way of how it is related to my method, when I reach to a certain level of comprehension of reading my code method, the results is that whenever I am reading down the code that I made to break down a certain technique that I am reviewing again from the Anki app, as long as I know the context and still have a sense of familiarity of how that certain Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu technique from a video tutorial plays out, especially still knowing how to start the technique and know how it should end, with just that limited amount of information to go off from to associate and relate to, my brain just gets better over time of doing the job for me in deciphering, filling the missing gaps of information, and making me think what's the most logical way in combining all the pieces of a technique together in a way that makes the most sense in order to connect and read all the code that is associated and related with the right movements together correctly enough step by step until I can finally reach the end to the desired outcome of remembering all the steps that is required in knowing how that certain technique should be performed in certain situations. Again, I probably one day will make a separate video to explain my lazy code method in further detail with demonstration, so please subscribe and wait for more.